Hello and welcome to Voices of the Industry, a podcast series bringing you leading industry voices who challenge thinking across transportation, infrastructure and cities.
Hello listeners, thanks for tuning in. Today's Voice of Industry is a bumper one. Our conversation with John Larkinson of the Office of Rail and Road was packed full of the challenging contribution of regulation to the UK's railways and roads. We didn't want you to miss out of the interesting insights and opinions that John and Stephen Wainwright, our UK Managing Director, had to share. So we've split our conversation into a two-part podcast. I hope you enjoyed the first part. Hello folks, welcome to another edition of Steer's Voices of Industry. Over the last 8 years or so, and over 30 articles and podcasts now, we have captured the views, experiences and insights of key players in their sectors from across the globe. You can find those at steergroup.com under the Insights tab. Today is no different about the conversation, and I'm very pleased to be joined online by John Larkinson, the Chief Executive Officer of the UK's Office of Rail and Road, or the ORR as we say here in the UK. It's fair to say that the ORR currently plays a key role in the UK transport sector. It is the independent economic and safety regulator for Britain's railways and the monitor of performance and efficiency for England's strategic road network. It aims to hold infrastructure managers Network Rail and High Speed 1 to account and to make sure that the rail industry is both competitive and fair. The ORR also protects the interests of passengers and has other economic regulatory functions. It regulates health and safety for the entire mainline rail network in Britain, as well as London Underground, light rail, trams, and the heritage sector. I'm sure we'll just get into how the ORR operates and how it has to evolve with John shortly. But let me first introduce you to John, my guest. John has been CEO of the ORR for over 5 years, first on an interim basis before being confirmed into the role in March 2021. With over more than 20 years' experience working within the rail industry, he was Director of Network Regulation and Affordability, as a first term of affordability that we're coming across today, at the Strategic Rail Authority before joining the ORR in 2005. Whilst at the ORR and before becoming CEO, John had various roles, including Director of Railway Markets and Economics, as well as Director of Planning and Performance. John, welcome. Thank you for joining us. How are you today?
Very good, Mike, and thank you very much for inviting me.
Yeah, it's great to have you with us. Have I captured your career appropriately?
I think you have. I was just going to add one thing, because my experience of rail started a little bit before I joined the Strategic Rail Authority, because I actually, for quite a short period, about 9 months, I was seconded onto the rail privatisation team at the time of privatisation of the railways in Britain in what would have been about the mid-90s. Those 9 months actually got me interested in rail. And it was only I then worked in consultancy for a while. And it was only when I saw the Strategic Rail Authority being set up, which was around about the turn of the century, that it sort of then gave me an opportunity to move back into rail.
We share a common thing, because I joined the railway in 93 and was experiencing privatisation within a train operating company. And I think that sucked me in as everything was changing around me. There was a new landscape to play with, new tools and processes to develop. It was an exciting time. The change has continued, I think, over the last 3 decades.
I think that's a fair summary, yes. It was in some ways a remarkable time. And I just remember the speed at which things happened then. I mean, there's quite a bit of debate now about how fast or slow things do happen. But I remember going in there and all contracts between each of the companies in the new privatised rail system, they all had to be finalised. And I remember being told they've all got to be done in the next 9 months. And that was it. It's a pretty clear target, admirably clear target, really. But it was a very different time, as you say.
We might well get back onto that, because it's a lot easier to break something up than it is to put it back together again, as I think we're finding a bit now. Let me quickly introduce my fellow guest or host today, Stephen Wainwright. Stephen is a consulting professional. The last 20 years, he's been with Steer in various roles, including leading our global aviation practice. Currently, Stephen is our acting UK Managing Director, leading the team here in the UK. His previous experience includes working with the CAA, the Civil Aviation Authority in the UK, and air traffic, and also advising on air traffic management across Europe. So he has a great understanding of incentives, regulatory asset bases, price controls, etc. Stephen, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Mike. Welcome, and hello to John as well.
Thank you. John, I've tried to commit myself that, as rail professional, that we won't get sucked into a rail-centric, UK-dominated conversation today, and that we'll try and broaden the consideration of where regulation comes into play in transport more generally, so it's more accessible for our global audience that are listening. I was going to start with, let's talk about how you got sucked in. You've already told me about the privatisation unit. Was there something else? Because I think I saw that you actually have 2 degrees, both in economics, but one of them's in health economics, and you weren't sucked into the challenge of UK health system as opposed to UK rail.
Right, you put me on the spot there. Yes, I do indeed have a British master's degree in health economics, and I believe I was one of the first 6 people to get one. It was an entirely new degree, and obviously I was a lot younger back in those times, and I had a very big idea that I was going to be having a sort of pivotal role in the future development of health policy in Britain. But slightly naively, I went for a job at what was then a British Department of Health and Social Security. I got a job there as an economist, and I thought I was going in there to lead the health transformation. I met the chief economist, and he just took one look at me and said, we've got a good job for you on pensions. And that was it, really. And so you may say I didn't handle it very well. Maybe I was a bit naive in terms of my sort of, I think it was only my second job. But yes, I actually became a pensions economist for some time. It wasn't quite what I was expecting, but I'm sure it stood me in good stead.
I'm sure, and we might ask towards the end of this about the parallels between health economics and rail economics, 2 sectors with some pretty challenges and lots of strong opinions about them as well. So let's talk about your role. You've been chief exec now, as you say, confirmed in roles early 2021. What's your day look like? What's the daily regime of the chief exec of the ORR, and what you drive the organisation to achieve?
Well, I could go for the sort of classic cliche of everyone's different, but I think the thing about the ORR, we're actually a relatively small organisation. We've got about 350 staff. We're based in 6 offices across Britain. So my day is certainly geographically spread in terms of our range of operations. And because we're, as you say, a health and safety regulator and an economic regulator, and we also cover the Channel Tunnel as well, I would say it's extremely varied in terms of the type of work we cover. We have an independent board as well. We are an independent regulator. We have a board which is independent and very much guards that independence. So I work very, very closely with the board on decision making. And I think it's fair to say we have a very, very close interaction with government. And as you did talk about your international listeners, the rail industry in Britain is very heavily subsidised. The strategic road network in Britain is paid for almost entirely by the government. And by definition, if you're a regulator of 2 industries with very, very high degrees of public funding, you're going to spend quite a bit of time with your relevant government departments and with the Treasury. And I suppose the final point is that there's a lot of interest in rail and road nationally in Britain. We spend quite a bit of our time dealing with external stakeholders, with the media, and also with a huge supply chain. There's a very, very big private supply chain going into what are 2 nationalised industries. So I'd say I'm regularly dealing with a very wide range of organisations and people. But indeed, that's what makes it interesting.
Yeah, a complex set of interfaces and organisational personalities to nurture and master, I guess.
Indeed, and then the thing is, you've always got to keep your mind is, well, what's the end game? And the end game is that the users of the networks, both rail and road, it's almost easy to get lost in the system if you're not careful, and stand back and say, let's just have another look through about why are we doing this? And so we've got rail and road, we've got freight and passengers, and of course we've got the taxpayer. And what you might say more broadly, the public interest. And ultimately, we are guardians of the public interest.
So, I mean, the ORR is, as you described, critical to rail sector, providing that monitoring role for the strategic highways in England. Standing back from the specific role of the ORR in those 2 sectors, how important is transport regulation in the UK these days? Do you think it's grown in importance?
Yes, I think it has. I mean, there are other transport regulators in Britain. I mean, we have an aviation regulator, in effect, the Civil Aviation Authority, and we don't deal with that. But I think that if you think about why is it so important, just look at the scale of the industry. There's only one Network Rail. Network Rail owns virtually all the rail infrastructure in Britain, not everything, but virtually everything. It's spending just on its core business over £10 billion a year. You know, that is a big company by most standards. National Highways is a bit small, but it's still a significant company. So I think just the scale on rail of having a single monopolist of such a wide reach, having such a big impact on every other company, and it's publicly funded, so you have a political dimension. It does put a lot of emphasis on the regulator really sort of holding the ring there and bringing, crucially, transparency to the whole process in the nature of the industry. And your point about is it grown in importance? I guess the different one for me there is around the National Highways one, because the legislation for that actually set up our role as a regulator. And I think the word in the legislation does refer to monitor, but we are a regulator of national highways. And the reason why I use the word regulator is that we have enforcement powers. We can require the company to do something, and to me, that immediately, the monitors don't have that. So I probably shouldn't say it, but I always thought the legislation didn't quite capture in that single word the role. Those enforcement powers are crucial, but if you look at the role of regulation there, it was very much as part of a package. The government wanted to see a package which got national highways more focused on the user again. So it's less of just maybe sort of a very good engineering company and more sort of, why are we doing this? What are the users of the network working for? So that, in a sense, was quite a big structural change for highways, strategic highways in Britain, in the relationship between a new company and a new regulator. And that took some while, I think, to settle in. It's you've been a company that's never had a regulator before, and you get one. and we had no prior experience in road, and we get that role. That was a big shift. I mean, I really remember the early period. It was just hard work all around.
Yeah, but learning on both sides.
Indeed,
Stephen, John's exposition around the role of regulation in the sector. Any perspectives from how you've seen its change in Europe? Do you see increasing demand for independent regulation?
I think there is, and I think probably something which John's been obviously a lead of is a lot of the regulation was brought in the mid-80s with private industries being privatised and companies being regulated through that process. I think increasingly there's a recognition throughout Europe that regulation needs to play a role with both private companies but also publicly funded companies and corporatized companies. And incentives may be different in those organizations, but they still need to play a role in trying to achieve what John has also described is what the consumers need. And that's a process that I think it's probably been happening for 20 or 30 years, but it is something which is certainly a trend which continues.
Thank you. I'm intrigued by that. With an unregulated market, the consumer, the user, provides the incentive on the organisation to adapt. And I'm intrigued, John, a question I've got is, do you see the regulation as a driver of change, that you are a catalyst and a force for good which causes an organisation to change? Or are you more of an arbiter and judge to know whether they're going fast enough?
I'd probably say that we try to be more of a driver of change. I mean, just to illustrate that, we used to have quite lengthy debates, less so now, but back in the day, about enforcement, about an emphasis on enforcement. You give the company a clear target. If it doesn't deliver, you enforce. Personally, I always felt, well, I don't think most users of systems are actually massively interested in sort of retrospective enforcement if things have already gone wrong. I don't think that necessarily gives people what they want. But by way of contrast, and I'm not saying this is completely black and white, I think you probably do have to vary a bit in different circumstances. But if you look at, say, Network Rail, and every year it's got an efficiency target. So you could wait to see whether it hits the efficiency target and then do something about it. You could try and punish it in some way. Although because it's a nationalised industry, in effect, there are fewer sort of private sort of incentives there. But what we just found a lot more useful, we did a lot of work with Network Rail on leading indicators of efficiency. How good a set of leading indicators could we get, which actually gave a pretty high degree of forecasting accuracy, perhaps up to a year out. We're not talking years and years out, but within, say, an annual business cycle. And that's just proved so much more valuable, really, because we spent a lot of time getting them right. We tracked them together very closely. They proved to be pretty accurate. And that's allowed a much more sort of nuanced conversation about, say, spreading lessons across the different regions of Network Rail, just to make sure everyone's picking up on all those efficiency points, rather than just saying, well, no, we've failed. And it doesn't work in all areas. I wouldn't say it was a panacea, but as a general rule of thumb, I really think that's worth driving for.
And Stephen, any view on European perspectives that you've seen, or aviation perspectives, of how, whether it's enforcement or leading incentives, lagging or leading the indicators, whether is what the UK and what John and the ORR are doing different to what you might have perceived in Europe, or is that pretty consistent?
I mean, I think it does come back to where the company's decision making is coming from. What the governance of the company, where can you put the incentives? But I'm very much a believer in having the balance right, really, across those different levers that are available to regulators. And using that balance, it may be tailored in a slightly different way depending on the industry and depending on the ownership arrangements and the incentives of that company. But using a balance across those three, I think, is important.
One of the important perspectives in that relationship of using the different levers available, I guess, John, is that as a health and safety regulator, that's quite different to the economic regulation role, or it plays. There's a relation those things, and I wonder how, because the ORR didn't start off with that role; it was given it later on, and I'm just wondering, how have you seen that come to bear in the organisation, and what does it mean for the day-to-day operation and functioning of the ORR?
You're absolutely right, Mike. I mean, certainly when I first joined the ORR, we were what you might call a pure economic regulator. We had no health and safety powers. And then a decision was taken and legislation was introduced effectively to move the health and safety teams from what was then the health and safety regulator more generally into the ORR. And that was a big cultural change. I mean, it wasn't just a sort of technical change, it was a cultural change. You were bringing two very different groups of people together with very different backgrounds. And at the time, there were quite a few people, certainly people externally, who said, well, this is not right. This is not going to work. You shouldn't be mixing economic decisions and health and safety decisions. And I think that's been proved as an argument be conclusively wrong. Absolutely, no doubt. And I still have people arguing about this today, so I'm happy to debate it because people are still debating it. But I'm absolutely convinced that there is a more informed debate and discussion about both health and safety issues and economic issues because we've got those two groups of people together. And just to give, if I just had time for one very quick example, the rail sector in Britain, rail usage is down, revenues are down. There's a lot of pressure to save money, not surprisingly, and it's taxpayer funded, and you've got looking to save money. So Network Rail have had a proposal about modernising their ways of working on maintenance. It's called Modernising Maintenance Proposal. In a full year, it could be gross savings of around £100 million a year. It's a big initiative. The main issues with it have been concerns about health and safety implementation of it. Could it be implemented safely? It's different ways of working. And we've approached that in a sort of dual way. We've looked at we looked at the efficiency sides of it, but we've had our safety inspectors go down to meetings at incredibly local level, in individual delivery units with trade union teams, talking through exactly how we check the potential health and safety implications of it. And as a result of that, effectively by that sort of collaborative workings, the Network Rail have agreed it. It's gone through all the safety processes. The unions have been very closely consulted. And And I hope that will effectively be a more robust proposal over time because of the degree of working from different angles as that has gone into it. I'm not saying it's perfect or there weren't debates along the way, but to me, it's more likely to hold as an initiative and change. And that's one of the benefits of having a regulator covering both angles from my perspective.
And in the day-to-day operation of the organisation, how do you bring those because they've got different capabilities, as you said. I can imagine at your top team, safety professionals, economic regulation professionals coming together. Does it come together at a lower level, at the coalface level? Or?
Absolutely, yes. We have a process of escalating concerns that we have with Network Rail. So we have a sort of basically we have a list of almost like a watch list of things we're looking at that we think might turn into concerns. Then they get escalated literally into concerns, and we rank them. And if you look at the way that process works, then people actively debate whether effectively this is, say, a safety or asset management issue. It happened particularly on structures, as an example. We had an issue about backlogs of inspections of structures, things like bridges and things like that. What's the best way of tackling this? Was it really a safety issue, or was it more of an asset management issue? And those sort of debates, as you say, at that sort of what you might call a working level, really the sort of coalface, I think are great. I think they're invaluable. They just lead to better outcomes.
And Stephen, how does you perceive it working in the aviation sector?
Well, I think it's evolved. I think in many ways the UK was a leading proponent of how this worked, and there was a separate economic and safety regulator, but it was still part of the CAA. And I think you can really contrast that with how the regulatory oversight of air traffic management in Europe was introduced, which it was only really introduced in the late 1990s. There were indicators and performance areas which covered safety, capacity, environment, and cost efficiency. So it really reflected the evolution of regulation over that period, whereas a lot of focus in the early days was around the kind of costs and the cost efficiency. There actually are now indicators on equally important areas of safety, the amount of capacity that's available in the system, and the environmental impact of operating the system. So I think that's a matter of time, I think, and the benefit of other regulators ploughing the way previously in that area.
Stephen, you picked up that broader agenda, and particularly I'm thinking now about the environmental and social delivery of transport, I guess, of asset management, etc. And John, how are things evolving? Because it seems to me now that the good news is we talk about transport and its outcomes a lot more clearer than perhaps we did before. We know why we have a transport system, but there is expectations about how those outcomes are now achieved through, minimizing carbon footprint and operating sustainably and delivering social value through these things. How does the ORR wrestle with which I think is still an emerging agenda, an emerging science in some of these areas?
It is definitely an emerging science, and it's been quite a significant change over the few years. You go back, literally back in the day, I don't remember much debate about biodiversity units and things like that. I mean, that's in asset terms, this is a relatively short-term issue, whereas now you look at national highways running the street road networks in England, and they have targets around increasing biodiversity units. They've got targets they're held to account for. We publish the outcomes of those and whether they're making progress towards it and net gains. And it is a big shift. In some ways, though, the shift the other way of the impact of the environment on the assets, I think in some ways has just been even more profound. It's been a huge feature of our work over the last few years on rail and road, an area of quite big debate as well, especially when you've got a constrained funding environment, how you prioritise in that scenario. And it's led quite big shifts in spend by assets, more spend on drainage, for example, particularly on rail. I mean, and we monitor that whole area far more closely than I remember 10 years ago or whenever. The focus we put into the analysis of drainage assets, the resilience of drainage assets and of earthworks, and And the issue for us in Britain, unlike I think a lot of countries, is just how old our asset base is. We've got a lot of assets going back 150 years or more, and they were designed in a world where people didn't have to think much about these things, and that is really driving costs now in the system, and some fairly ruthless prioritisation, because it drives a debate about, well, you might want to add lots of nice things to this railway network, and let's have lots of enhancements and new lines and things. But if it's going to cost more to maintain your core asset base over the years, and at the moment, looking forward over the next 5 years, we will not sustain the condition of the core asset base. It's going to get a little bit worse. That they're quite profound issues in terms of choices that will have to be made over time. And of course, they're not very glamorous bits of work compared to, obviously, not surprising that a lot of politicians, members of parliament in Britain, or their constituents, people would like a new station, wouldn't they? Or they'd like maybe a new line to connect them to another part of the country, or something like that. And of course, those things add to the asset base as well. And I'm not sure we've quite entirely really confronted some of the very, very tough choices, trade-offs that have to be made in the future.
Do you think decision makers understand those difficult choices, those trade-offs, or they don't understand, they can't see them, or they can see them, but they're too difficult to take at this stage, and we'll wait a little bit longer?
It's interesting, I suppose, in a semi-political context where we have it's often said in Britain that the Treasury are basically the sort of custodians of the finances here. They're not interested in the longer term, or they don't get these big picture things. Actually, I find they do. I find they very, very much do get it. But of course, they're having to make choices and priorities too. But certainly, when we provide analysis of the road network or the rail network, there's actually an awful lot of interest in just what is happening to the core assets. Are they being maintained? Yes or no? And how does that feed through into the future delivery? Because and obviously, as a regulator, what's the point of having a regulator if they're not there at least as a custodian of the long term public interest? So even if we think people aren't getting it, as you say, Mike, well, actually, it's sort of our job to explain it, isn't it? Because there's no excuse for a regulator going into sort of victim mode and saying, well, they don't get it. In our case, we've got to get out there and we've got to say, look, if you care about the long-term asset base here, this is what's going to happen. But actually, I find the Treasury extremely well informed about the long term, the need to maintain and sustain a long-term asset base.
And how I'm intrigued by the capabilities of the ORR. Because as you say, we're wrestling with new agenda, social value, sustainability, biodiversity, as you said, and now we're talking about seasonal impacts and trying to understand climate science. How do you equip the ORR with those insights and that capability to communicate to decision makers and to push your regulatories? I'm not sure what you would call your subjects of regulation.
I'll pass on the exact word, but your question is a very good one. It's actually very challenging, because if you look at the number of areas we cover, we cover health, we cover safety. We're a competition regulator as well. We publish national statistics across rail. So what you tend to find is that each specialist team may be 2 to 3 people. And hence, operationally, from my perspective as a chief executive, operationally, there's a sort of fragility there in terms of trying to get resilience and get teams to sort of overlap a bit to get so you've got a bit more resilience in the system. And the one that we spent a lot of time on recently is just the impact of software in trains. Back in the day, trains were. Well, a lot of it was about mechanical engineering. And if the train failed, you had somebody who knew their mechanics and could find where it had gone wrong. Whereas now we see increasing examples where it's very hard to explain why something has happened. And in terms of our skill base, we have hired more external support on that. We've also basically redone our training regimes for some of our safety inspectors to try and build a skill base around understanding software. And obviously there'll be this is only heading in one direction, so there'll be a lot more of that. So yeah, we like every organisation, we have to adapt to a changing requirement, and we have to try and compete in some of those markets. But they're quite hard markets to compete in, and so we need. So the trick for us is to be quite precise about what we need. Where we need someone who understands enough to ask the questions, rather than can sort of solve the entire coding problem by themselves, where we're probably better off going to a specialised private company.
Yes, I was only having a conversation this morning with an industry colleague who, when I said I was chatting to yourself later today, was saying, the ORR, they need to get into the regulation of data, because so much will be dependent on data going forward to influence the real world. It's the control of data that's going to be so important going forward. Another capability you're going to have to add.
Yeah. Well, whoever that was, we're pleased to know that at our board last month we were debating our new data strategy. So we're I wouldn't say we solved it, but we're on the case.
So in preparation for the podcast, I asked colleagues from Steer, and particularly the rail team here in the UK, what questions we should pose to you, John. And this has come from the team, and I'm assuming there's a vested interest or a perspective on it. So they were asking about that environmental, social delivery angle, particularly about how it compares with other European countries. But the question then went on to ask about how has Brexit changed the relationship between ORR and its counterparts? Has Brexit given you some more freedom? Has it given you ability to compare and contrast, perhaps, with other regulation across Europe? What's your take?
Brexit did have quite a profound impact on us. We were integral part of lots of groups across Europe dealing with what you might call things like technical standards or safety issues. And we actually, going back over the years, we've actually played quite a leading role in the development of many standards, and indeed the approach to safety in terms of sort of more risk-based approach rather than a rules-based approach, you might say, to very general terms. All that went. I mean, that largely disappeared, and that was quite a big impact. I haven't personally seen, this is not a political comment, but I don't think there's any sort of particular gain from the ORR from Brexit. What we have done is tried to maintain our contacts with European countries, because a lot of them are relevant for sort of almost like you go back to your data points, with data and intelligence gathering, comparing, contrasting. So we've tried to maintain that, but it has been a profound change. Although I suppose going back to the sort of the point about sort of different approaches, we do actually see that on a day-to-day basis in terms of the regulation of the Channel Tunnel. We work really closely with our French, with our counterparts in France, and you do see the interesting differences of approach. It was only recently that a very, very powerful electricity interconnector was installed in the tunnel. The first time, as far as I know, it's ever been done in a live running tunnel anywhere in the world, although one of your listeners might correct me on that. But so this was to allow basic electricity to be traded between Britain and France. And it's actually turned out to be extremely valuable both ways. And while some of the French nuclear reactors were down for maintenance, the British electricity was shipped over. So it's useful for both countries, and it's been a very substantial revenue generator for the Channel Tunnel Company. But the safety issues around that and the debate about the safety issues were very, very technical, very, very intense debates with two different approaches to the way that safety is addressed in legal terms, and very different backgrounds from ourselves and our French counterparts into how we both looked at the issues. But the fact is, we work together very, very, very well. We've got extremely good relations. So you do have different approaches, but they can be overcome as long as the will's there. But for us, this is a sort of day-to-day issue in terms of health and safety, and at the moment, and more recently in terms of access to the railway. Because at the moment, I mean, just to explain for sort of listeners more generally, there's only one train company that basically really moves you between London, Paris, and other cities. And in recent months, 3 competitors have named themselves, which is quite a sea change in the operating environment. And now but those operators are going to be traveling in through different countries and through the tunnel. So again, we are in discussions with our counterparties around that. So these issues are still there. The issues of geography and competition, health and safety remain.
Yes. Stephen, you've done a number of studies for the European Commission, European Parliament on helping to identify policy, but also reviewing the impact of policy. Have you got any perspectives on how I suppose different nations and regulators have worked across well, or where you've seen that it really hasn't worked and some people have abdicated to comply or something?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big issue, I think, Mike, in terms of how well do people work together. And I think there's different experiences, really. I think where things have evolved with working with regulators to get the regulations that perhaps were better than regulations being imposed and the regulators catching up with it. And there are a few occasions in the EU where regulations have been imposed and it's taken quite a long time for the kind of regulators to catch up. I think the classic one is something that all of us will be affected by is passenger rights. And that's gradually come across all transport modes. It was originally in aviation, but it's actually now in all transport modes. I think that has taken some time for cooperation and the systems to really catch up with the concept. So I do think it does depend on where you started from.
Thank you. I mean, so that was talking about, I suppose, regulation across geographical boundaries. John, I wanted to talk to you about transport system. Rail and road, they connect to other things. They require the connection to other things. There are, as you said, you were indicated earlier, there are more regulators in the UK than just the ORR. How is the interaction between different regulators, between modes, networks, utilities? How's that going? How do we ensure that regulatory ecosystem which emerges is both efficient, coherent, agile, and supports the development and deployment of new technologies such as zero emission vehicles, which needs energy, which will be located on transport mobility hubs? And how is that working?
So just think about whether it's best to illustrate more general or through some examples. So just taking your point about, certainly electric vehicles, charging points. If you look at national highways, it was agreed fairly early on that there should be an aim to get a certain number of charging points at every service station, and I think it was agreed pretty quickly, actually. But then, as you say, there are interfaces not just between regulators, but between government, regulators, private companies, financial arrangements. So that they're never easy, but I think it's been shown that they can be done. But you also get operational interfaces. So if you look, say, at the work that National Highways does and the work that Network Rail does, often these intersect at points. They affect each other, or they might both be jointly working in an area. And I do think that and this matters to people at the local level. How much disruption these works cause, and people think, well, couldn't they just talk to each other? And this is a very common. You can see why people think, no, sure, it's obvious that they could talk to each other. And I do actually think over the last few years that Network Rail and National Highways have actually got better at coordinating, joining up their work. It's not always possible to iron these things out, but and this partly, I think, reflects Network Rail and National Highways' increased regional focus. It's not all done from central HQ, where everything seems frankly slightly distant. There's much more regional planning. And so it might seem sort of, well, okay, how many jobs are you talking about? But to the individuals involved, affected by them on the ground, these are quite important things. And so I don't think sort of almost like small-scale local cooperation should be overlooked either. We tend to gravitate to the sort of big, really exciting stuff, don't we? But these things matter at all levels. I suppose, going back to the other level, really, really high-level point. The regulators in Britain do talk to each other. There are forums. There's even a chief exec's forum for regulators in Britain. So they do talk to each other. And I suspect, though, that it's just a little bit different in rail and road because there are literally fewer companies. There are quite a few water companies or electricity providers and things like that. There's only one National Highways, and there's only one Network Rail. So the dynamics, I think, are a little bit different in terms of joining up between different organisations. But it happens. I think sometimes, though, people people sort of use joining up in slightly different ways. I think what sometimes people mean by joining up is like, can't one of you put more money into it? Yeah. So I frankly feel sometimes we talk in euphemisms, and what people really just say, they're not actually interested in the process of joining up at all. They want more cash to go into a particular area, and that is a slightly different point.
So, folks, that's the end of part 1 with John. In the next part, we'll shift gears to discuss specific projects, including HS2, and explore how these decisions shape the future of rail infrastructure. I'm looking forward to sharing how we dive deeper into these topics in our next instalment. See you then.